In the cafeteria of Sandhurst Road School in Catford, southeast London, 38 children were having their lunch. Wednesday, January 20th, 1943. Midday. The war felt distant that afternoon. A cold January day where the biggest worry was finishing your vegetables before pudding. Above the chatter of forks on plates and children's voices, no one heard the approaching thunder. No sirens wailed their warning. No air raid wardens rushed through the streets. The balloon barrage that should have been floating above London sat grounded, useless. Then, at 12:30 p.m. exactly, Hauptmann Heinz Schumann released a single 500-kilogram bomb from his Fw190. The explosion tore through the dining room like the hand of God reaching down to crush innocence. In an instant, lunch became a tomb. Teachers who had been reminding students to eat their greens were silenced forever. Children who had been passing notes and giggling simply ceased to exist. But here's what makes this story truly haunting. This wasn't the Blitz. The Blitz had ended nearly 2 years earlier. London had survived Hitler's fury in 1940 and 1941. The city had endured, adapted, rebuilt. By 1943, Britain possessed the most sophisticated air defense system in the world. Radar that could see in the dark, fighter aircraft that could reach 400 miles per hour, controllers who could vector interceptors onto enemy formations with precision that seemed almost magical. Yet on that cold January day, 28 single-seat fighter bombers penetrated to the heart of London in broad daylight, bombed schools and pubs and power stations with impunity, killed 67 civilians, and exposed a flaw in Britain's defenses that no one had imagined possible. This is the story of how Germany's butcherbirds caught Britain sleeping, why a school full of children paid the price, and what happens when tactical innovation meets complacency. It's a story that's been largely forgotten, buried beneath the more famous narratives of the Blitz and the bomber offensive. But for the families who lost loved ones that day, and for the military planners who realized how close they'd come to catastrophe, January 20th, 1943 remains a day of reckoning. To understand what happened on January 20th, we need to wind the clock back to September 7th, 1940. That was the day London first burned. For 57 consecutive nights, German bombers hammered the British capital. The Luftwaffe came on 56 of those nights, wave after wave of Heinkel 111s, Dornier 17s, and Junkers 88s, dropping high explosive and incendiary bombs on a city that had never experienced anything like it. The statistics alone tell a story of devastation. More than 40,000 British civilians killed during the Blitz, about half of them in London. Over 1 million homes destroyed or damaged in the capital alone. Entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble, the docks ablaze, St. Paul's Cathedral standing defiant amid a sea of flames during the Second Great Fire of London on December 29, 1940. But the Blitz wasn't just about London. Liverpool, Birmingham, Coventry, Manchester, Sheffield, Hitler's bombers struck anywhere they could hurt British industry and morale. Coventry particularly suffered. On November 14, 1940, 1 million pounds of bombs fell on the medieval city, creating devastation so total that the Germans coined a new verb, to coventrate, to utterly destroy a place. But for all the destruction, the Blitz failed. British morale didn't break. Production continued. The RAF fought back with increasing effectiveness. And in June 1941, everything changed when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, his invasion of the Soviet Union. The Luftwaffe pivoted east, and the skies over Britain grew quieter. The survivors of the Blitz could be forgiven for thinking the worst was over. By 1942, Britain's defenses had evolved into something formidable. The chain-home radar network that had won the Battle of Britain now extended across the country. New fighter aircraft, faster, more deadly versions of the Spitfire, the powerful Typhoon, the versatile Mosquito, patrolled British skies. Anti-aircraft guns had multiplied, their crews trained to levels of proficiency that earlier defenders could only dream of. Ground controllers could track incoming raids and vector fighters onto them with precision born of hard experience. Britain had learned. Britain had adapted. Britain felt secure. But wars have a way of punishing complacency. By 1943, the strategic bombing campaign had become a contest of wills and revenge. The RAF's Bomber Command, under the ruthless leadership of Arthur "Bomber" Harris, was building toward the devastating area bombing campaigns that would make names like Hamburg and Dresden synonymous with firestorm and death. In April and May 1942, Hitler had ordered the so-called Baedeker raids, named after the famous German tourist guidebooks, targeting Britain's historic cities: Canterbury, Bath, Exeter, Norwich, York, places chosen not for military value but for cultural significance, attacks designed to hurt British morale by destroying heritage. The raids killed over 1,600 civilians and damaged or destroyed 50,000 homes along with irreplaceable historic buildings. Then came January 16, 1943. RAF Bomber Command sent 201 heavy bombers to Berlin, the first major attack on the Nazi capital since November 1941. The Lancasters and Halifaxes struck at the governmental heart of Hitler's Reich, a direct challenge to German power. Hitler's reaction was predictable and immediate. He demanded Terrorangriff, terror raids in retaliation. London would burn again. The Luftwaffe attempted their revenge on the night of January 17th-18th, launching 2 waves of bombers totaling 90 aircraft against targets in East London. The plan called for strikes on the King George V docks, West India docks, and railway facilities on the Isle of Dogs. But the raid failed spectacularly. By 1943, the Luftwaffe that had terrorized Britain in 1940 was a shadow of its former self. Its most experienced crews were dead, captured, or fighting in Russia. The new pilots lacked the training and skill of their predecessors, and they faced British defenses that had evolved far beyond what the Blitz-era Luftwaffe had encountered. That night, January proved it. Bad weather confused the German formations. Searchlights stabbed upward, forcing bombers higher, where winds scattered their aim. British controllers vectored night fighters onto the streams with deadly efficiency, and perhaps most humiliating, British deception worked perfectly. Dummy fires and decoy sites tricked German crews into dumping their bombs onto empty fields and wasteland.
Of 115 tons of bombs dropped on Britain that night, only 43 tons actually hit London. The Luftwaffe lost 6 aircraft, a prohibitive casualty rate for such meager results. In the operations rooms of Luftflotte 3, the German air fleet responsible for operations against Britain, staff officers faced an uncomfortable truth. Conventional night bombing against London had become a losing proposition. British radar saw them coming. British fighters cut them down. British defenses had closed the night sky. But what if there was another way? The Focke-Wulf Fw190 was never supposed to be beautiful. It was supposed to be deadly, and at that it excelled beyond anyone's wildest expectations. When the Fw190 first appeared over France in September 1941, British pilots thought they were hallucinating. The Spitfire Mark V, Britain's frontline fighter, suddenly found itself outclassed by a radial engine fighter that looked like a barrel with wings but flew like a demon. The Fw190 could outturn it, outdive it, outclimb it, and outgun it. German pilots called it the Würger, the shrike or butcher bird, a small predator known for impaling its prey on thorns. The nickname fit perfectly. The Fw190 killed with surgical precision. But by 1943, the Fw190 had evolved beyond air superiority fighter. The A4 variant could carry bombs up to 500 kilograms slung beneath its belly. As a fighter-bomber, or Jabo in Luftwaffe parlance, it became something new, a fast, agile, deadly platform that could deliver ordnance with the speed and maneuverability no bomber could match. Along the south coast of England, towns like Folkestone, Hastings, and Eastbourne had learned to fear the tip-and-run raids. A dozen Fw190s would hammer across the English Channel at wave-top height, too low for radar to detect reliably. They'd pop up over a coastal town, drop their bombs, strafe anything that moved, and disappear back over the water before RAF fighters could scramble. Hit and run. Quick and brutal. The tactic worked because it exploited a fundamental limitation in British defenses. Radar needed altitude to work effectively. The curvature of the Earth meant that low-flying aircraft could hide beneath the radar horizon, invisible until they were practically overhead. By the time ground observers spotted them and alerted defenses, the Fw190s were already gone. But these were just coastal nuisance raids, pinpricks against seaside towns. No one had tried to use the tactic against a major target deep inland. No one had tried to use it against London. In an operations room somewhere in northern France, Luftwaffe planners stared at maps and contemplated the impossible. London lay 90 miles inland from the English Channel, 90 miles of hostile territory, 90 miles where British radar, observers, fighters, and anti-aircraft guns could detect, track, and destroy any attacking force. The last successful daylight raid on London had been in 1940, and even then the Luftwaffe had paid in blood. But what if they flew the entire route at treetop height? The plan that emerged was audacious to the point of suicidal. 28 Fw190 A4U-3 fighter bombers from the 10th Staffel of Jagdgeschwader 26, Fighter Wing 26, would carry the attack. Each aircraft would carry a single 500-kilogram SC-500 bomb. They would fly across the channel at wave-top height, cross the English coast at Beachy Head, and continue at treetop level all the way to East London. Speed would be their defense. The Fw190 could sustain 350 miles per hour at low level. Any higher or they'd be detected. Any slower and they'd be caught. Messerschmitt Bf-109s would fly top cover, protecting the vulnerable Yabos during their bomb run and extraction. A small diversionary force would peel off to bomb Maidstone in Kent, reinforcing British assumptions that this was just another coastal raid. Timing would be critical. Noon, lunchtime, when the streets would be full but anti-aircraft crews might be at reduced readiness. The attack would be so sudden, so unexpected, that air raid sirens would never sound. The architect of this plan operated under the shadow of one of the Luftwaffe's most legendary figures, Oberst Joseph Pix Priller, commander of JG-26. Priller stood just 5 feet 4 inches tall, but his stature had nothing to do with his reputation. With 101 confirmed victories, all against Western Allied aircraft, Priller embodied the aggressive spirit of the Luftwaffe fighter force. His nickname, Pips, came from his small size, but no one who flew with him thought him small. He was a warrior who led from the front, a commander who would later become famous for his lone strafing paths over the Normandy beaches on D-Day 1944. The only documented Luftwaffe daylight attack on the invasion beaches. Under Priller's command, JG-26 had become an elite unit, and for this mission he chose Hauptmann Paul Keller to lead the actual strike. Keller commanded the 10th Staffel, and his pilots were among the best in the Geschwader. As January 20th dawned, those pilots prepared their aircraft at bases in northern France. Ground crews loaded the 500-kilogram bombs, each one capable of destroying a building or killing dozens if it hit a crowd. Armorers belted ammunition for the 4 MG-15 20mm cannons that gave the Fw190 its devastating firepower. The pilots themselves were a mixed group. Some were veterans of the Battle of Britain, men who had flown against Spitfires over the Channel in 1940 and survived. Others were relative newcomers, trained in the crucible of the Eastern Front before being rotated west. They shared one thing: absolute confidence in their aircraft and their mission. Among them was Hauptmann Heinz Schumann of Jagdgeschwader II, born November 29, 1914. At 28, Schumann was old by fighter pilot standards, a career officer who had been flying combat missions since the war's beginning. He would carry bomb load number 17. His target, as briefed, was simply a large building in the Catford area, what the intelligence photos suggested might be a factory or administrative block. None of them knew they were about to make history, and none of them knew that some of them would never see France again.
At noon precisely, 28 Fw190s lifted off from their French bases, the roar of their BMW radial engines splitting the cold January air. The formation didn't climb. Instead, the focke-wulfs dropped to wave-top height almost immediately, their pilots skimming so low that spray from the Channel Whitecaps misted their windscreens. This was flying at its most demanding. One moment's inattention, one slight error in altitude, and an aircraft would cartwheel into the sea at 350 miles per hour. But these were the experten, the experts. They held formation with the precision of men who knew their lives depended on it. Above them, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 escorts weaved in a loose protective screen. The 109s would climb to altitude once they crossed the English coast, ready to engage any RAF fighters that tried to intercept. For now, they stayed low, adding to the radar invisible swarm streaking toward England. In the operations rooms of RAF Fighter Command, the morning had been quiet. Radar operators stared at their cathode ray tubes, watching the familiar phosphorescent glow that indicated the channel's electromagnetic signature. Controllers plotted the positions of their own fighters on patrol. Everything was routine. Then, at 12:15, the first confused reports began arriving from ground observers near Beachy Head. Aircraft, type unknown, crossing the coast at very high speed, very low altitude. Multiple aircraft, heading northwest. The reports should have triggered immediate alarm, but they didn't, for one simple reason. German fighters raiding the south coast had become almost routine by 1943. Tip-and-run attacks were a nuisance, not a threat. The Germans would bomb Folkestone or Hastings, strafe a few buildings and disappear. Annoying, but hardly worth scrambling major fighter formations. When several Fw190s peeled off to bomb Maidstone, the diversion worked perfectly. Controllers relaxed slightly. Just another coastal raid, probably already heading home. No one imagined that the main force was continuing northwest at treetop height, following the contours of the landscape, racing toward London at nearly 6 miles per minute. In London itself, the city hummed with its wartime routine. The morning shift at the Deptford West Power Station monitored their generators, keeping electricity flowing to homes and factories. At the Royal Naval College in Greenwich, officers went about their administrative duties, paperwork and planning sessions that kept the Royal Navy functioning. In Catford, at Sandhurst School, the lunch period was in full swing. The dining room echoed with the controlled chaos of children eating, the clatter of cutlery, the scrape of chairs, the voices of teachers maintaining order. Mrs. Connie Taylor moved between tables, ensuring her students ate properly. Miss Gladys Nowelden helped serve portions. Mrs. Virginia Carr supervised the youngest children, making sure no one went hungry. None of them heard the balloons that should have been floating above London, their steel cables waiting to shred any aircraft that dared fly low. The balloons were grounded. Essential maintenance, the official explanation went. Training exercises for the balloon crews. Perfectly reasonable decisions, the kind made every day in wartime. Except on this day, those decisions would cost lives. At 12:28 p.m., the Fw190s reached the outskirts of London. The pilots pulled up slightly, trading some of their precious low-altitude concealment for visibility and attack positions. Now they could see the city spreading before them, the grey sprawl of southeast London, industrial districts and residential areas blending together in the weak winter sunlight. No sirens wailed, no searchlights stabbed upward. The streets were full of people. The formation split, each pilot heading for his designated target area. Some would hit Lewisham, others Deptford, Greenwich, Bermondsey. The scatter pattern would maximize confusion and make interception harder. The light anti-aircraft guns that protected London from low-altitude attack sat silent. Their crews had no warning, no time to man their weapons. By the time gunners recognized the sound of approaching aircraft, the Fw190s were already overhead, already attacking. The first bombs fell at 12:29. In Lewisham, 4 RAF barrage balloon sites erupted in fire and shrapnel as Fw190s strafed them with 20mm cannon fire. The balloon crews, caught completely unprepared, died at their posts. Without the balloons aloft, the sky belonged to the attackers. At Sydenham, a pilot spotted a gasworks and opened fire with his cannons. High-explosive incendiary rounds punctured the gas holder, and it ignited with a whooshing roar that could be heard for miles. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air, a pillar of fire marking the raid's violence. In Greenwich, one Fw190 made a precise attack on the President's house at the Royal Naval College. The bomb smashed through the roof and detonated inside, the explosion ripping through the historic building. Masonry and glass rained onto the grounds as flames licked from shattered windows. 3 more Fw190s found the Deptford West Power Station and attacked in sequence. The first bomb hit the main generator hall. The second struck the transformer yard. The third penetrated the control room. Fires erupted across the complex as fuel lines ruptured and electrical equipment exploded. Soon, 30 fire engines would be racing to the scene, their crews fighting a blaze that threatened to black out large sections of South London. The pilots had been briefed to bomb military and industrial targets, but at 350 miles per hour and treetop height, identification became guesswork. That large building, was it a factory, a warehouse, a barracks, or was it a school?
Hauptmann Heinz Schumann's Fw190 howled over Catford at 12:30 p.m. Below him, buildings blurred past, streets, parks. Then a large multi-story structure, its playground visible, its shape distinctive. According to his briefing, this was a large building, industrial or administrative, a legitimate target. What witnesses would later report suggests Schumann made 2 passes. The first, perhaps, to identify the target. The second, to attack. Or perhaps there was never any identification at all. Perhaps in the chaos and speed of the attack, Schumann simply saw a large building and released his bomb. We will never know. Schumann died in action on November 8, 1943, over France, shot down with his truth and his intentions. The 500-kilogram bomb fell away from the Fw190's belly. In the dining room at Sandhurst Road School, no one heard it coming. The bomb didn't whistle or scream like in the movies. It simply fell, obeying the laws of physics, arcing down from a few hundred feet of altitude. It struck the school at the precise moment when the dining room was fullest. Children, teachers, staff, all gathered for the midday meal. The detonation was instantaneous and catastrophic. 500 kilograms of high explosive, roughly 1,100 pounds, transformed in a microsecond from solid matter into expanding gas at temperatures exceeding the surface of the sun. The shockwave radiated outward at supersonic speed, collapsing walls, buckling support beams, and turning the dining room into a killing box. 24 children died immediately, their bodies crushed by falling masonry or killed by the blast's overpressure. 2 teachers died in the same instant, Mrs. Connie Taylor and Mrs. Ethel Betts, their final acts probably trying to shield their students. 5 more children died on a staircase, caught trying to flee. 9 died in second-floor classrooms as ceilings collapsed. 3 teachers perished in the staff room: Mrs. Virginia Carr, Miss Mary Jukes, and Miss Gladys Knowlden. 1 more teacher, Miss Harriet Langdon, died in a science room. 6 additional children would die in hospital over the following days, their injuries too severe for 1943 medicine to treat. The final toll: 38 children and 6 teachers. 44 people who had been alive and eating lunch one moment, gone the next. But numbers can't capture what happened at Sandhurst Road School that day. Numbers can't describe the chaos in the immediate aftermath: dust and smoke billowing from the wreckage, the screams of the injured, the eerie silence from those buried deepest. Within minutes, the first rescuers arrived. Civil defense workers, heavy rescue squads with their specialized equipment for moving rubble, REME soldiers from St. Dunstan's College nearby, Canadian troops stationed at Bromley Wood, and the parents. Word spread through Catford like wildfire. A bomb, the school, children dead, injured, trapped. Parents ran through the streets toward Sandhurst Road, their faces masks of terror. Mothers in house dresses who had been preparing tea, fathers who left their work mid-shift, grandparents who had been minding younger siblings. They arrived to find organized chaos. Rescue teams worked with systematic efficiency, clearing rubble, shoring up unstable walls, listening for sounds of life beneath the debris. But the parents couldn't wait. They pushed past police cordons, their hands bleeding as they tore at the rubble with bare fingers, calling their children's names. The police couldn't stop them. It was, one officer later testified, virtually impossible to stop distraught parents from digging frantically for their children. Some found their children alive, injured but breathing, pulled from pockets of space where falling debris had created voids. Others found small bodies that looked almost peaceful, as if sleeping. The worst finds were those too damaged to identify immediately, and parents had to wait, hoping against hope that their child was elsewhere, evacuated to hospital, confused but alive. The rescue operation continued for hours. Every piece of rubble had to be moved carefully. Instability threatened further collapse, and survivors might be trapped beneath. Doctors and nurses worked in the wreckage itself, treating injuries on the spot when moving victims might kill them. By nightfall, the full scope of the tragedy was clear. Sandhurst Road School had suffered one of the worst single incidents of civilian casualties from bombing in London during the entire war. While Sandhurst Road School became a tomb, the other Fw190s continued their rampage across southeast London. In Oscar Street, Deptford, a bomb fell among a group of residential buildings just as people were emerging from their homes, drawn to the sound of aircraft and explosions. The bomb detonated at ground level, and the blast tore through the narrow street like a tidal wave of pressure and shrapnel. 17 people died. Men, women, children, entire families erased in an instant. On Eland Street, also in Deptford, the Chicha pub took a direct hit. It was lunchtime, and the pub was moderately busy, workers on their break, pensioners having their daily pint, the publican and his wife behind the bar. The bomb penetrated the building and detonated inside. The pub collapsed in on itself, timber and brick and bodies mixing in the wreckage. 9 people died.
Machine gun and cannon fire added to the carnage. The Fw190's 4 20mm cannons could fire 900 rounds per minute combined, a stream of high-explosive and armor-piercing shells that could cut through brick walls and human bodies with equal ease. On Glenfog Street in Catford, witnesses heard the scream of an Fw190's engine and the distinctive ripping sound of its cannons firing. 12 pedestrians were hit by cannon shells or fragments, arms, legs, torsos torn by 20mm projectiles designed to destroy aircraft. Some died instantly. Others bled out on the pavement while rescuers tried desperately to save them. In Bermondsey, 15 people died from various bomb hits and strafing attacks. The Fw190s seemed to be firing at anything that moved, a calculated terror tactic, or simply pilots drunk on adrenaline and the absence of resistance. In total, 22 bombs fell across London, 8 in Lewisham, 2 in Poplar, 12 scattered across Deptford, Bermondsey, and Greenwich. Some hit their apparent targets, the power station, the Naval College, the balloon sites. Others fell on residential streets, pubs, shops. The pattern suggested both deliberate targeting and indiscriminate attack. By 12:35 p.m., just 7 minutes after the attack began, it was over. The Fw190s formed up and raced back toward the channel at treetop height, their bomb racks empty, their ammunition expended. Behind them, southeast London burned. As the Fw190s streaked toward the channel, RAF Fighter Command finally reacted. Spitfires and Typhoons scrambled from airfields across southeast England, their pilots burning with fury at the audacity of the German attack. Controllers vectored them toward the retreating enemy, tracking the formation as it climbed slightly for the channel crossing. The resulting air battle over the water was brief but savage. 3 Fw190s fell to British fighters, their pilots bailing out into the cold channel waters or dying in their cockpits as their aircraft tumbled into the sea. 4 Messerschmitt Bf-110s from the escort force also went down, their sacrifice buying time for the Yabos to escape. Additional aircraft limped back to France damaged, their fuel tanks holed, their control surfaces shot up, their pilots wounded. The official tally recorded 10 aircraft certainly destroyed, 4 more probable, and 8 damaged, losses approaching 25% of the attacking force. For the Luftwaffe, this was unsustainable. The Fw190 was too valuable an aircraft, its pilots too experienced, to throw away on raids that, however successful tactically, could never be repeated at such cost. But for Britain, the damage assessment told a different story. 67 civilians dead, over 100 injured, a power station crippled, a naval facility damaged, a school destroyed, and perhaps most importantly, the myth of invulnerable air defenses shattered. How had this happened? How had 28 single-engine fighters penetrated 90 miles inland to attack the capital in broad daylight? The recriminations began immediately. On January 27, 1943, 1 week after the raid, Secretary of State for Air Sir Archibald Sinclair faced Parliament. The chamber was packed. Members demanded answers. How could German fighters reach London undetected? Why weren't air raid sirens sounded? Why were the balloon barrages grounded? Who was responsible for the deaths at Sandhurst Road School? His defense was careful and legalistic. He explained that 60 German aircraft had crossed the south coast between Bexhill and Dungeness. He noted that they did not fly straight to London, but moved in such a way as to indicate that their intention was to drop their bombs in Sussex or Kent. In other words, the diversion to Maidstone had worked perfectly. British controllers thought they were seeing a coastal raid, not a strike on London. Regarding the air raid warning system, Sinclair defended the policy of restricted warnings. Britain used a targeted alert system that only warned areas where attack was actually impending. Mass warnings for any German aircraft crossing the coast would enable the enemy to dislocate the civil life of the country at very little cost and lead to public indifference. The logic was sound, but cold comfort to the dead at Sandhurst Road School. Sinclair acknowledged that this policy must entail the risk that on occasion bombs would be dropped without warning. That risk had come due on January 20th. The balloon barrage failure drew particular fury. Why were the balloons grounded during daylight when attacks were possible? Sinclair's answer: indispensable work connected with the air defenses of London was then in progress. Training exercises, maintenance, essential work that required the balloons to be down.
Except no one had anticipated the Germans would exploit precisely that vulnerability. When the order finally went out to raise the balloons to 6,500 feet, given after the Fw190s were reported crossing the coast, it was already too late. The attackers reached inner London only a minute or so after the order had been given. Some balloons had risen to 500 feet, while others were still grounded. The inquiry at Lewisham Town Hall painted a picture of heroic response once the attack occurred. Civil defense services, rescue squads, military units all performing admirably. But it couldn't escape the fundamental question, why had there been no warning? The official conclusion tried to put the best face on failure. The suddenness of the attack gave some members of the public a disagreeable sense of insecurity. But if the defenses incurred reproaches which no excuses could quite repel, they did much to atone. For the enemy paid for his success with the loss of 3 fighter bombers and 6 fighters. It was true that the German losses were significant, but the British public knew that 9 German aircraft was cold comfort measured against 44 dead at a school, 67 civilians total, and the psychological blow of realizing their defenses weren't as impenetrable as they had been led to believe. The nation's grief focused on Hither Green Cemetery on a gray February day. 31 children and 1 teacher would be buried together in a mass grave, a civilian war dead plot that spoke to the democracy of death in wartime. Rich and poor, the children lay together, their individual caskets too many to process separately, their families united in loss. The Bishop of Southwark, Bertram Simpson, conducted the service. His words offered what comfort theology could provide. But what comfort is there really when 38 children are dead? 7,000 mourners attended, parents, siblings, neighbors, teachers who had survived, and strangers who simply needed to bear witness. They stood in their dark coats in the cold drizzle, listening to prayers and hymns, watching as casket after small casket was lowered into the ground. 38 children, ages 9 to 11, 6 teachers, women who had chosen to shape young minds and instead died protecting them. Their deaths weren't unique in a war that killed millions, but they were personal, local, shocking in their suddenness. The mass grave at Hither Green remains today, marked by a rectangular stone surround containing a raised tablet with inscriptions. Flowers appear there regularly, placed by descendants who never knew these children, but carry their memory forward. Sandhurst Street School, now Sandhurst Primary School, maintains a stained-glass window and memorial garden. Current students learn about January 20th, 1943, understanding that their school building stands on ground where their predecessors died. Memory persists, grief fades, but never disappears. Strip away the tragedy and the politics, and January 20th, 1943 stands as a remarkable tactical innovation, the first successful deep penetration daylight raid by single-engine fighter bombers against a major defendant city. The Germans had identified a critical vulnerability in modern air defense: radar's dependence on altitude. By flying at treetop height for 90 miles, the Fw190s remained invisible to the chain home stations that had helped win the Battle of Britain. Ground observers spotted them too late. The scatter pattern prevented effective interception. The speed of the attack from coast to target in 15 minutes gave defenders no time to react. It was in many ways a preview of tactics that wouldn't become standard until the jet age. Low-altitude penetration to avoid radar, high speed to avoid interception, precision targeting to maximize effect. But it was also unsustainable, and both sides knew it. The losses, nearly 25% of the attacking force, were prohibitive for the Luftwaffe by 1943. German fighter production couldn't replace pilots and aircraft at that rate. The element of surprise, once lost, couldn't be regained. Future attempts would face alerted defenses, balloons in place, fighters pre-positioned, controllers ready. More fundamentally, Germany lacked the heavy bombers and trained crews to conduct sustained strategic bombing campaigns. Hermann Göring himself complained, in a rare moment of honesty, that it was enough to make him scream that Germany lacked heavy bombers like the Lancaster or fast light bombers like the Mosquito. He described Allied four-engine bombers with terrific envy as far, far ahead of anything Germany possessed. The Luftwaffe's bomber arm in 1943 consisted largely of obsolescent medium bombers, Henkel 111s and Junkers 88s designed in the mid-1930s. Against modern defenses, they were death traps. The Fw190 fighter-bomber raids represented desperation dressed as innovation. Operation Steinbock, Germany's attempted sustained bombing campaign against Britain from January to May 1944, proved the point. The Luftwaffe assembled 524 bombers but caused minimal damage while losing 329 aircraft. Losses greater in percentage than RAF Bomber Command suffered over Germany. Meanwhile, Britain's defenses adapted quickly. Balloon barrages stayed up. Low-altitude radar coverage improved. Fighter tactics evolved to counter the Fw190 speed. By mid-1943, tip-and-run raids had become increasingly costly and decreasingly effective. The strategic lesson was clear. Tactical innovation could achieve surprise and local success, but couldn't substitute for strategic capability. Germany could embarrass Britain's defenses on a single day in January 1943, but it couldn't break them. History often focuses on aircraft and tactics, but wars are fought by people. The Fw190s that attacked London carried pilots, men with names, families, fears, and fates. Oberst Josef Priller survived the war. The diminutive ace who commanded GG-26 during the raid would fly until war's end, accumulating 101 victories, all against Western Allied aircraft. His fame would come primarily from that lone strafing pass over the Normandy beaches on D-Day. Priller and his wingmen, the only Luftwaffe fighters brave or foolish enough to attack the invasion in daylight. After the war, Priller lived quietly, working in various businesses, rarely speaking about his wartime service. He died in 1961, aged 46, from a heart attack. Those who knew him said he never spoke about London, never mentioned January 20th, 1943. Whether guilt, indifference, or simply a soldier's compartmentalization, we can't know.
Hauptmann Paul Keller, who led the actual attack, survived the raid but not the war. Records show he was killed in action later in 1943, though exact details remain elusive in fragmentary Luftwaffe records. Hauptmann Heinz Schumann, the pilot who bombed Sandhurst Road School, died November 8, 1943, shot down over France by Allied fighters. He was 28 years old. Did he know what he'd done? Did he care? His aircraft went down with those answers. Of the other pilots who flew that day, most died before war's end. Fighter pilot survival rates were brutal on all sides by 1943. Those who survived rarely spoke of specific raids. The killing blurred together. Today London, tomorrow a convoy escort, next week a desperate dogfight over France. On the British side, the defenders who failed that day carried their own burdens. Controllers who didn't vector fighters in time. Balloon crews whose equipment sat grounded, radar operators whose sets couldn't see low flyers. These men did nothing wrong individually, but collectively they failed, and civilians died. The rescue workers, by contrast, earned nothing but praise. The heavy rescue squad members who dug through Sandhurst Road School's rubble for hours. The doctors and nurses who treated children in the wreckage. The soldiers who came from their barracks to help. the strangers who formed human chains, passing rubble, searching for survivors. These were Britain's true defenders, not the radar sets and fighters that failed, but the ordinary people who responded when crisis struck. January 20th, 1943 was one day in a war that lasted 6 years and killed perhaps 80 million people. In the cosmic scope of World War II, it barely registers. A footnote, a minor incident, a tactical curiosity. Yet zoom in, and it's everything. For the parents of 38 children, January 20th, 1943 was the day the world ended. For the survivors of Sandhurst Road School, it was the day innocence died. For British military planners, it was the day they learned complacency kills. For German pilots, it was a day of tactical triumph purchased at unsustainable cost. The raid occurred at a pivotal moment in the war. By January 1943, the tide had turned decisively against Germany. At Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army was in its final agony, surrounded and starving. In North Africa, Rommel was retreating toward Tunisia, chased by Montgomery's Eighth Army and soon to be trapped by American landings. In the Atlantic, the U-boat threat was peaking but about to collapse under improved Allied anti-submarine tactics. Germany was losing, and everyone knew it, including the Germans, though they couldn't admit it yet. The January 20th raid represented desperation disguised as daring. Germany couldn't bomb Britain effectively anymore, couldn't match British production, couldn't replace pilots as fast as they died. So they resorted to pinprick raids designed more for propaganda than strategic effect. Goebbels' propaganda machine made much of the attack. German newspapers trumpeted the Luftwaffe's return to London, describing devastating strikes against military and industrial targets. Photos of damaged buildings ran under triumphant headlines. The pilots were portrayed as heroes, brave warriors striking back at the British who dared bomb Berlin. The reality, as German military leaders understood, was more sobering. One successful raid couldn't change the war's trajectory. The losses suffered made repetition impossible, and Britain's strategic bombing campaign against Germany was only intensifying. Hamburg would burn that summer, destroying over 40,000 acres and killing perhaps 40,000 civilians in Operation Gomorrah. The bombing war had become a contest of industrial capacity and will, and Germany was losing both. Why does January 20th, 1943 matter today? The raid has been largely forgotten, buried under more famous events. The Blitz of 1940-1941 dominates British memory of the bombing war. D-Day, the Battle of Britain, Dunkirk, these are the events that shaped national mythology. A brief fighter-bomber raid in 1943 can't compete. Yet the raid teaches lessons that transcend its tactical details. First, it demonstrates the danger of complacency. Britain in January 1943 had grown confident, perhaps overconfident in its defenses. The Luftwaffe seemed beaten, incapable of serious attacks. That confidence cost 67 lives and showed that war always punishes assumptions. Second, it reveals how tactical innovation can temporarily overcome strategic advantage. Germany was losing the war badly by 1943, but clever tactics still allowed local successes. The Fw190 low-altitude approach exploited a real gap in British defenses, proving that ingenuity matters even when facing superior resources. Third, it illustrates the cruel arbitrariness of war. Why did Hauptmann Schumann bomb Sandhurst Road School? Was it deliberate? A terrible mistake? The fog of war? We'll never know, but 38 children and 6 teachers died regardless. Intent matters little to the dead. Fourth, it demonstrates the resilience of civilian populations. Within days of the raid, Londoners were back to their routines. Schools reopened, workers returned to the damaged power station, the pub on Eland Street was cleared away, and life continued. The British government's policy of restricted warnings, controversial as it was, reflected an understanding that constant panic would do Germany's work for them. Finally, it reminds us that war's greatest victims are often the most innocent. Fighter pilots signed up for danger. Soldiers understood the risks. But the children having lunch at Sandhurst Road School on January 20th, 1943, did nothing to deserve their fate except exist in a world where adults had chosen war over peace. Today, few physical traces of the January 20th raid remain. Sandhurst Primary School stands rebuilt, though portions of the original structure survived. The memorial window in the school depicts a shepherd with children, a deliberate religious metaphor for innocence and protection. The memorial garden provides a quiet space for reflection, maintained by generations of students who learn the building's history. The mass grave at Hither Green Cemetery receives regular visitors. Descendants leave flowers. Local historical societies organize commemorative events. The stone memorial bears 32 names. Others were buried in individual family plots elsewhere. The other impact sites have disappeared into London's urban landscape. The power station at Deptford has been demolished and redeveloped. The Royal Naval College's President's House was repaired and shows no obvious damage. The pub on Eland Street was rebuilt. Oscar Street looks like any other London residential street. Only those who know where to look can find the scars. The Fw190s themselves met various fates. Some were shot down that day. Others flew combat until destroyed or captured. None survive today in flying condition, though museums preserve examples of the butcher bird as testament to its formidable reputation. Hauptmann Schumann's aircraft, the specific Fw190 that bombed the school, crashed somewhere in France in November 1943. Its wreckage was likely scrapped for metal during or after the war, following the fate of tens of thousands of destroyed aircraft. In German archives, records of the raid exist but remain fragmentary. Post-war, neither side had much incentive to highlight an event that embarrassed British defenses while demonstrating German desperation. The raid fell into a historical gap, too late to be part of the famous Blitz, too minor to merit major study, too uncomfortable to remember with pride. In 2023, 80 years after the raid, researchers interviewed one of the last surviving witnesses, a woman who had been 6 years old in January 1943. She remembered the sound first, a roaring unlike anything she'd heard before, growing rapidly louder. Her mother grabbed her and pulled her away from the window just as the aircraft screamed overhead, so low she could see the pilot's helmet. Then the explosions, the windows shattering inward, the ground shaking, the sudden, terrible silence afterward, followed by sirens and screams. Her family was lucky. Their house suffered only minor damage. But her best friend from school never came back. The funeral with all those tiny caskets haunted her dreams for decades. She spoke matter-of-factly about it, the way very old people discuss ancient pain. She said simply, it was war. Terrible things happened. You carried on because what else could you do? That pragmatic resilience, the British tendency to absorb horror and continue functioning, defined the home front experience. The raid shocked London, but didn't break it. Within weeks, the story faded from headlines. Other events demanded attention. The war ground onward. But for families who lost loved ones, time stopped on January 20th, 1943. Every birthday never celebrated. Every Christmas with an empty chair. Every graduation, every wedding, every grandchild never born. Multiply that loss by 67, the official death toll, and then multiply it again by all those who loved each victim. Hundreds of lives forever altered by 12 minutes of violence on a cold January day. In the end, what does the Fw190 raid on London teach us? Perhaps that war remains personal even when fought with technology. The pilots who flew those missions weren't faceless monsters. They were young men following orders, flying aircraft, pressing buttons, and never seeing the individual faces below. Modern war's great horror is the distance it creates between killer and killed. Perhaps that defensive success requires constant vigilance. Britain's defenses worked brilliantly most of the time, but most of the time isn't enough when enemy innovation finds the gap.
The raid proved that no defense is perfect, no system infallible. Perhaps that tactical victories don't equal strategic success. Germany won on January 20th. They bombed London, caused casualties, and escaped with tolerable losses. But they couldn't repeat the success, couldn't exploit it strategically, couldn't change the war's outcome. The raid was a brilliant tactical surprise that meant nothing in the larger picture. Or perhaps the real lesson is simpler and darker, that civilians always pay for the decisions of their leaders.
Hitler ordered retaliation for the Berlin raid. RAF Bomber Command had struck German cities. Now the Luftwaffe struck back. And 38 children eating lunch in a Catford school paid with their lives for decisions made in Berlin and London by men who never saw their faces. The Sandhurst Road School Memorial stands today as testament to this truth. The stained glass shepherd watches over empty desks. The memorial garden grows peaceful in summer. And every January 20th, those who remember gather to ensure the dead are not forgotten. Because that's all we can offer the victims of war. Memory. The promise that their deaths weren't meaningless. That we learn from history. That we honor their sacrifice by building a world where such tragedies need not recur. Whether we've succeeded in that promise remains an open question. The Fw190s that attacked London on January 20th, 1943 have long since turned to rust. The pilots are decades dead. The buildings have been rebuilt, but the children's names carved in stone at Hither Green Cemetery remain. They were real. They lived. They died violently and young because humans chose war over peace. That's the legacy of the Butcherbirds raid on London. Not tactical innovation or strategic assessment, but 38 small caskets lowered into cold ground on a gray February day, while 7,000 mourners wept for futures that would never be. We call them casualties of war. We should call them what they were: children who wanted to finish their lunch and go back to class.